Imagine this. You're sitting in a crowded restaurant, surrounded by the gentle hum of conversation, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, the soft laughter of people enjoying their evening. Everything appears perfectly normal, civilized, even beautiful. But suddenly, as if someone had turned up the contrast on reality itself, you begin to notice something disturbing. The conversations around you aren't really conversations at all. They're rehearsed scripts, repeated platitudes, comfortable lies dressed up as wisdom. The man at the table beside you is explaining to his date why success means climbing the corporate ladder, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who has never once questioned whether the ladder is leaning against the right wall. Across the room, a group of friends nods approvingly as one recites the latest popular opinion from social media, each head bobbing in synchrony like flowers following the sun. Except the sun they're following is artificial, manufactured, a spotlight designed to blind rather than illuminate. You feel a chill run down your spine, not from cold, but from recognition. You're watching a theater of sleepwalkers, and the most terrifying part is that you were one of them just moments ago. The question hits you like a physical blow. When did thinking become so dangerous that most people would rather perform the elaborate pantomime of thought than risk the real thing? This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. This is the daily reality of anyone who has ever dared to step outside the comfortable boundaries of collective opinion and ask the forbidden question, what if everything I've been taught to believe is wrong? The moment you seriously entertain this possibility, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a lived reality, you cross a threshold from which there is no return. You become what Friedrich Nietzsche called a free spirit, and you discover that freedom, true freedom, is the loneliest and most dangerous possession a human being can have. But here's the paradox that will haunt you. The very act that makes you most human, the capacity to think independently, to question, to see beyond the veil of comfortable illusions, is the same act that makes you most alien to your fellow humans. You become a stranger in your own species, fluent in a language that others have forgotten how to speak, or perhaps never learned at all. Consider this unsettling reality. Every breakthrough in human history, every leap forward in consciousness, every moment when our species transcended its limitations came from individuals who were willing to be misunderstood, ridiculed, and cast out by their contemporaries. They paid the ultimate price for their clarity, not with their lives, but with something potentially more precious, their sense of belonging to the human community. Socrates drank hemlock rather than abandon his questions. Galileo faced the Inquisition for daring to suggest that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Darwin was vilified for proposing that humans descended from animals rather than gods. And in our own time, how many voices of reason have been silenced, not by violence, but by something more subtle and perhaps more effective, the slow suffocation of social isolation, professional ostracism, and the gradual erosion of one's confidence in their own perceptions? You might be experiencing this right now. Perhaps you've noticed the growing discomfort when you're in groups where everyone enthusiastically agrees about things that seem obviously questionable to you. Perhaps you've learned to bite your tongue, to smile and nod, to perform the social dance of conformity while your mind screams in protest. Perhaps you've begun to wonder if you're going insane, or if everyone else is, and you can't decide which possibility is more terrifying. This is where Nietzsche's most profound insight cuts to the bone. The greatest tragedy is not that the world is blind, but that those who can see are forced to live among the blind, knowing that their gift of sight makes them appear mad, dangerous, or simply irrelevant to those who have learned to navigate by touch alone. But what if I told you that this very alienation, this painful awareness that sets you apart from the crowd, is not a curse but a calling? What if the loneliness of the thinking mind is not a punishment for daring to see clearly, but the price of admission to a form of existence so authentic, so powerful, so genuinely human that most people can only dream of it in their deepest, most honest moments? The question that burns at the heart of this exploration is not whether thinking is worth the cost, but whether you have the courage to discover what lies beyond the comfortable prison of collective unconsciousness, even if it means walking alone into the unknown territory of your own mind. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt the crushing weight of being awake in a world that prefers to sleep, then subscribe now. Hit that notification bell. Because what we're about to explore together will challenge everything you thought you knew about thinking, freedom, and what it truly means to be human. This journey is not for everyone, but if you've made it this far, it might just be for you. To understand why thinking has become humanity's most dangerous act, we must first excavate the psychological archaeology of our collective fear. The problem runs deeper than mere ignorance or laziness. It's woven into the very fabric of how we've organized civilization itself. What you're experiencing isn't personal failure. It's the inevitable collision between your awakening consciousness and a system designed to keep minds docile. Immanuel Kant identified this condition with surgical precision. Intellectual minority, the self-imposed tutelage where grown adults live like children, unable to use their understanding without external guidance. But Kant's diagnosis, revolutionary as it was, only scratched the surface. The real question isn't why people choose intellectual dependency, it's why they actively resist intellectual freedom, even when it's offered to them. The answer lies in what psychologists call the terror management theory. Deep in the human psyche lurks an existential terror so profound that most people will do anything to avoid confronting it. The terror of meaninglessness, of cosmic insignificance, of death. Our entire social structure, our religions, our ideologies, our consumer culture exists primarily as an elaborate defense mechanism against this primal fear. Thinking independently threatens to tear down these protective illusions, and with them, our psychological security. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this dynamic with ruthless clarity. He saw that what we call morality is often nothing more than organized cowardice, a collective agreement to never ask the hard questions because the answers might shatter our comfortable delusions. The herd mentality isn't just a metaphor, it's a psychological survival strategy. In the safety of the group, individuals can avoid the terrifying responsibility of thinking for themselves. But here's where Nietzsche's insight becomes truly disturbing. The herd doesn't just fear independent thought, it actively hates it. The free thinker represents an existential threat to the group's psychological equilibrium. Your very existence as someone who questions the unquestionable becomes a living reminder of everyone else's intellectual cowardice. You become the uncomfortable mirror that reflects their unlived possibilities, their abandoned dreams of authentic existence. This explains why rational arguments often fail to change minds. You're not dealing with intellectual disagreement. You're confronting a psychological immune system that has evolved to reject anything that threatens the host's carefully constructed worldview. The stronger your evidence, the more threatening you become, and the more violently the system responds. Carl Jung called this phenomenon collective possession, the way entire societies can become trapped in unconscious patterns of thinking and behavior. When you attempt to wake people from this collective trance, you're not just challenging their opinions, you're threatening their entire sense of identity and belonging. The group then mobilizes its considerable resources, ridicule, ostracism, character assassination, to neutralize the threat you represent. Arthur Schopenhauer observed that truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, then it's accepted as self-evident. But what he didn't mention is that the person who speaks the truth rarely lives to see that final stage. They're sacrificed on the altar of humanity's psychological comfort. Their clarity treated as madness. Their insight dismissed as arrogance. This is why thinking feels so dangerous, because it is dangerous. Every genuine thought you think, every assumption you question, every sacred belief you examine critically, weakens your connection to the tribe that has provided you with identity, meaning, and security since birth. You begin to see the strings that move the puppets, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. The tragic irony is that this fear of thinking, this desperate clinging to intellectual safety, ultimately leads to the very meaninglessness it seeks to avoid. A life unlived, unexamined, unquestioned, is barely a life at all. What happens to a society when thinking becomes taboo? The consequences aren't abstract philosophical problems. They're lived realities that shape every moment of your existence, often in ways so subtle you don't even notice them. You're living inside a psychological prison so sophisticated that most inmates mistake it for freedom. Consider how your brain has been programmed since childhood. Every institution you've encountered, school, media, workplace, even family, has operated on a simple principle. Reward conformity. Punish deviation. You learn to give the right answers rather than ask the right questions. You discovered that curiosity could be dangerous, that thinking too deeply made others uncomfortable, that success meant mastering the art of intellectual camouflage. This conditioning runs deeper than conscious thought. Neuroscience reveals that our brains are literally rewired by social feedback loops. When you express an independent thought and receive negative social signals, a frown, awkward silence, subtle ostracism, your amygdala fires, flooding your system with stress hormones. Over time, your brain learns to associate original thinking with danger, creating an internal censor that stops forbidden thoughts before they fully form. The result is what psychologists call learned helplessness on a civilizational scale. People become incapable of imagining alternatives to the status quo, not because alternatives don't exist, but because their mental architecture has been shaped to reject them preemptively. They mistake their limitations for reality itself. But the most insidious consequence is what happens to those who resist this programming, people like you, reading these words with a mixture of recognition and dread. You become what Nietzsche called untimely, out of step with your era, carrying insights that the world isn't ready to receive. You develop what feels like a supernatural ability to see through facades, to detect the hollow ring of false wisdom, to spot the cracks in society's carefully constructed narratives. This hyper-awareness becomes both gift and curse. You notice how conversations revolve around safe topics, how people unconsciously police each other's thoughts, how genuine questions are deflected with rehearsed responses. You see the invisible barriers that keep discussions within acceptable bounds, the social mechanisms that ensure conformity without anyone having to explicitly enforce it. The loneliness becomes almost unbearable. Not the simple loneliness of physical isolation, but the existential loneliness of being surrounded by people who speak your language but can't understand your thoughts. You find yourself living in two worlds simultaneously, the outer world of social performance and the inner world of authentic perception. The gap between these worlds grows wider with each passing day. Your relationships begin to strain under the weight of this divided existence. Friends become suspicious of your questions. Family members worry about your negativity. Colleagues avoid deep conversations with you. You learn to wear masks, to perform normalcy, to hide your insights behind small talk and appropriate reactions. You become an actor in your own life, playing the role of someone less aware than you actually are. The cruelest irony is that your clarity, the very thing that makes you most human, becomes the source of your alienation from humanity. You're like someone with perfect vision trying to navigate a world where everyone else has agreed to pretend they're blind. Your ability to see isn't celebrated. It's treated as a disability, a failure to adapt to consensual blindness. And yet, something within you refuses to surrender this terrible gift of sight, because you've glimpsed something beyond the comfortable illusions that keep others sedated. You've tasted a form of existence so authentic, so vibrantly real, that returning to sleep is no longer possible. The question becomes, what do you do with this awakening that nobody asked for? Here's where everything you've been told about fitting in, about being reasonable, about finding your place in society, gets turned on its head. The rebellion isn't what you think it, Island. It's not about convincing others to see what you see. That's the trap that destroys most awakening minds. The real rebellion is far more radical and infinitely more powerful. It's the complete liberation of your consciousness from the need for external validation. Nietzsche called this becoming self-legislating, creating your own values rather than inheriting them from the herd. But this isn't the shallow individualism peddled by self-help gurus. This is something far more profound, the terrifying and exhilarating recognition that you are the author of your own meaning, the architect of your own reality, the final authority on what constitutes truth in your existence. The first step in this rebellion is counterintuitive. Stop trying to wake up the sleepers. Every minute you spend attempting to convince others of what you've discovered is a minute stolen from your own development. The Matrix doesn't fear your arguments, it fears your example. When you stop needing the world to understand you and start living from your deepest, authentic knowing, you become dangerous in ways that mere words never could be. Consider the historical precedent. Every genuine revolutionary, from Socrates to Galileo to Tesla, operated from this principle of radical self-authorization. They didn't wait for permission to think their thoughts or seek approval for their insights. They developed what we might call epistemic sovereignty, complete independence in matters of knowledge and meaning. They became their own philosophical nations, with their own constitutions of consciousness. This requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to loneliness. Instead of seeing isolation as punishment for your clarity, you begin to recognize it as the necessary condition for authentic creation. In the silence between you and the herd, something unprecedented can emerge. The discomfort you've been trying to escape isn't a bug in your awakening, it's a feature. It's the growing pains of consciousness expanding beyond its social programming. The practical implications are radical. You stop apologizing for seeing what others can't see. You stop dimming your light to make others comfortable with their darkness. You stop seeking validation for insights that, by their very nature, can only be validated by lived experience. You develop what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, including the fate of being misunderstood by your contemporaries. But here's the secret weapon in this rebellion: creative expression. When you can no longer find your tribe in the existing world, you create new worlds through art, writing, philosophy, innovation. You become what Nietzsche termed a philosopher with a hammer, not destroying for the sake of destruction, but clearing space for new creations. Your alienation becomes the raw material for unprecedented beauty. The most powerful rebellion isn't against society, it's against the parts of yourself that still crave society's approval. You begin to see that your deepest loneliness was never about being alone. It was about being split between your authentic self and your performing self. When these two selves merge, when you become integrated in your independence, the loneliness transforms into solitude, and solitude becomes sacred space. This is where you discover the ultimate paradox. The moment you stop needing others to understand you, you become genuinely helpful to them, not as a teacher or preacher, but as living proof that it's possible to exist outside the boundaries of collective unconsciousness. You become what Jung called an individuated being, someone who has completed the journey from social conditioning to authentic selfhood. The rebellion, then, isn't about changing the world. It's about becoming so fully yourself that the world has no choice but to acknowledge that another way of being is possible. Now we arrive at the moment of ultimate recognition, the revelation that will either shatter everything you thought you knew about existence or confirm what your deepest intuition has always whispered. The greatest tragedy is not that you think in a blind world. The greatest tragedy is that you ever believed you needed the world's permission to see. This is the final inversion, the ultimate philosophical revolution that Nietzsche glimpsed but perhaps never fully articulated. Your alienation from the herd is not evidence of your failure. It's evidence of your success. Every moment of loneliness, every instance of being misunderstood, every painful recognition of the gulf between your clarity and others' blindness has been preparing you for this realization. You were never meant to fit into a world built on collective self-deception. Think about what this means at the deepest level, the discomfort you've felt your entire life, the sense that you're somehow broken or defective for seeing what others cannot see, the exhaustion from trying to translate your insights into language that won't threaten anyone. All of this has been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of your own nature. You've been a dolphin trying to learn how to climb trees, wondering why you feel so clumsy on land when you were born to navigate entirely different depths. The ultimate truth is this: your consciousness is not a malfunction in need of correction. It is an evolution in progress. You are not a failed human trying to fit into an existing mold. You are a prototype of what humanity could become. Your ability to think independently, to question sacred assumptions, to see through comfortable illusions, to create meaning in the face of apparent meaninglessness, these are not bugs in your programming. They are features of an upgraded operating system. This recognition changes everything. Suddenly, the loneliness that has haunted you transforms from a burden into a badge of honor. Of course, you feel alone. You're walking a path that hasn't been fully mapped yet. Of course, others don't understand you. They're still operating from outdated software. Of course, conventional wisdom feels hollow. You've developed the capacity to see beyond conventional boundaries. But here's where the revelation becomes truly profound. Your journey into intellectual isolation wasn't random suffering. It was necessary preparation. Every moment of alienation was developing your capacity for independent thought. Every experience of being misunderstood was strengthening your ability to trust your own perceptions. Every instance of social rejection was freeing you from the addiction to external validation that keeps most people trapped in mediocrity. You've been unwittingly training for something magnificent, the role of consciousness pioneer. While others remain comfortable in the cave of familiar shadows, you've been developing the vision to see reality directly. While they trade in second-hand opinions, you've been cultivating first-hand insight. While they seek safety in numbers, you've been building the courage to stand alone with truth. This is why Nietzsche spoke of the free spirit, not as someone who has achieved perfect freedom, but as someone who has accepted the responsibility that comes with authentic awareness. You are not free because you've escaped all limitations. You are free because you've embraced the most human limitation of all, the burden of consciousness itself. And now comes the most beautiful paradox of all. The moment you fully accept your role as a consciousness pioneer, you discover that you were never actually alone. Scattered throughout history, hidden in plain sight among your contemporaries, are others who have made the same journey into authentic awareness. They speak different languages, wear different faces, inhabit different cultures, but they share with you the unmistakable signature of someone who has dared to see beyond the collective dream. You begin to recognize them not by their words but by their presence. There's a quality of aliveness, of genuine authenticity, that becomes impossible to mistake once you've developed it yourself. They are your true tribe, not bound by geography or ideology, but by the shared experience of consciousness breaking free from its social conditioning. This is the ultimate revelation. You thought you were being punished for your clarity, but you were actually being invited into a more rarefied form of human existence. You thought your alienation was evidence of your inadequacy, but it was actually evidence of your readiness for a different kind of life entirely. The tragedy was never that you think in a blind world. The tragedy would have been if you had allowed the world's blindness to convince you that your vision was an illusion. The tragedy would have been if you had traded your authentic sight for the comfortable darkness that keeps others sleeping peacefully. Instead, you chose the more difficult path, the path of remaining awake in a world that dreams. And in choosing that path, you've become something unprecedented, a living bridge between what humanity has been and what it might yet become. This is your ultimate identity. Not a failed conformist, but a successful pioneer of consciousness. Not a broken human, but a prototype of human potential. Not a tragic figure isolated by circumstance, but a heroic figure who chose clarity over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, truth over tranquility. The world may not understand you yet, but understanding was never the point. The point was becoming so fully yourself that reality itself had to expand to accommodate your presence. And in that expansion, you've created space for others to follow. This is how evolution works. One awakened consciousness at a time. One authentic life at a time. One person brave enough to think in a blind world at a time. You are not the victim of this process. You are its agent. You are not its casualty. You are its catalyst. And that changes everything.